Okay, so we are apparently back on live. I'm sorry for the interruption. We're trying to do our best. Like we're trying this out. Like the week of transition was programmed to be like in person. Mainly in like last minute we improvised and online programming. And so we're sort of testing what are the best methods. And so this is a try, and we'll hope it works good. It works well for the rest of this webinar. So I think we lost like the last 3 minutes from what I've been told of what Sophia was saying. It was really interesting. So I don't know if you can like maybe repeat, or you were talking about, how like this ignorance like can impact like your everyday work. Was that it? Like with
Yeah,
the climate in the climate movement? S-
yeah, it was something along those lines. I think what I was saying, I don't know when 3 minutes was exactly, but um, definitely one question I always get is like the why do some indigenous communities, fight for the land, and why do some indigenous communities not do that? And the answer is pretty simple: is that we all fight for the land in our own ways. So a lot of people just, take upon the teachings and make sure that they know the teachings of the land and everything that's connected to it. And some people just really want to learn the culture and the language and making sure that we have that to pass on to our next generations. But also, we have a lot of people that are on the front lines right now that are fighting for their land and their sovereignty that was supposed to be already guaranteed as an inherent right, as our own Indigenous laws in Canada, that we've never ceded. We've never given up our own laws and our own culture. And that's what we've been fighting for this whole time. But also that other Indigenous communities that sign on to these projects shouldn't be held accountable or kind of put in a situation where people say that they're betraying other Indigenous peoples or whatnot. It's really not an easy call to make as a community, whether or not they need to be put in that situation um, in the first place. Why are they impoverished in the first place? And the fact that they need to accept an extractive resource project just to get them at some type of bearable level of humanity, to have clean water or food on the table. I mean, this is something that is, a symptom of colonial violence that the government is responsible for. And we can't be, dividing each other up on this issue. This isn't supposed to be a divisive issue. This is actually a very unitarian issue where people are supposed to be coming together for this one cause, no matter where we are. Um, and Indigenous peoples are really coming together at this time. And, we're putting out the message that, we're still here. And non-Indigenous peoples need to understand that, we're all different. Indigenous communities are different. And their struggles are different too. The way they were impoverished or the way that they're facing colonial genocide at the moment might be different from a Cree Nation versus a Mi'kmaq Nation versus even two Cree Nations in the same province. So we just need to be mindful that, all Indigenous communities are different, their struggles are different, but in, a holistic mind that they're all the same. Um, and that the bottom line is that Canada is responsible for the genocide and ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples, and that we need to make sure, as non-Indigenous peoples, need to make sure that Indigenous peoples are having their voice heard in this climate movement. It is essential for Indigenous voices to be at the forefront because we have been saying this for 500 years, right? And to uplift those voices is critical in that movement.
Yeah, just kind of adding on to that a little bit. What Sophie said was really, really amazing, and thank you for your words. I believe um, one thing with the climate movement too, people in the climate movement are not always like um, doing things like against indigenous, kind of saying anything against decolonizing or indigenizing the climate movement directly, but there's also a lot of lessons that you can take from indigenous nations and indigenous teachings and apply them to the climate movement. For example, like values such as respect and responsibility. I've been talking a lot lately with like elders and with climate activists, and one thing that's really apparent is you have to be really careful to not get angry. There's so much to get angry about in both the climate movement and the indigenous movement with just the government's action. And it's really hard to not get angry. But you have to remember to not get angry and to hold that respect no matter how hard it is, because that's that's our teachings. Our rights, our culture, and everything kind of depends on those teachings. And so just applying those to kind of environmental movements is really important, because even though it's so easy to get angry, especially for like young activists, especially if you're right in the middle of it, you have to remember that like you can't really like last that way, and you also have to like remember that what you're doing, like from the indigenous lens, is like out of a place of love, like it's for our future, but it's also for the future of non-indigenous people, because we're protecting the land, which is the future. So just keeping that in mind is a really good way to begin decolonizing activism, keeping in mind just the respect and the love you have to hold.
Well, thank you. You're such good speakers. And I was wondering, talking about being angry and about, having this be, a heavy responsibility, to always explain what your reality is and to always have to tell your story, although, you already tell it, it's already accessible. Like we had this discussion previously together, and, does it sometimes feel like a burden to constantly have to explain all these things that might seem very basic also, and but that are so like necessary to like working together, or just like basic understanding.
Well, I always think that it's important to educate people. So I know Hannah, in our previous discussion, like we always say, like we don't mind that we need to reiterate these things for people who don't know. And I always like to share my personal experiences because it kind of gives like a face to the struggle, a bit personal, and knowing that these things aren't just something that happen to people far away in a different land. Like these are people standing right in front of you. It actually impacts people, and it actually makes people feel hurt, right? And like that feeling of shame to be native, or a feeling to try and hide your identity from police when they're present, or trying to maneuver the colonial system in various ways, whether it's working or in the education system. So I always take it upon myself anyway. But of course, that came from my own path, from being ashamed to be native, to actually understanding why that shame was there in the first place, and then understanding that that is a colonial symptom that has been passed through my family, and then trying to heal that within myself, and then educating people on it. So it takes a lot of different steps for people to be able to educate, and definitely for people who indigenous peoples who are still suffering from all of those feelings that are generational. It's definitely hard maybe to explain their personal story, so not every indigenous person will want to share their personal story, and you're not going to get some I don't know, medicine man teachings every time. But you might, if you talk to an elder, they might want to teach it to you. Every elder is different, right? And they're all different. So you'll get a different response every time. But I think that's what's beautiful when you talk to indigenous peoples, is like every time you ask a question, even to the same person, if you ask the question the same time, like you'll get a different answer, you know, out of me. Every time you'll get a different answer out of me. And it's just amazing how different we are, but how similar we are. And also, I do think that it is non-Indigenous people's, you know, obligation to understand the issues. So if they can read the documentaries or listen to the documentaries and read the books and talk to people that they know, or you know, just look it up. I mean, there's so many resources. There are allyship networks and Indigenous peoples almost everywhere you go. So just, you know, taking that time to educate yourself on the issues could also lessen the burden on someone else if it's a really tough issue, you know. But also if it's attending conferences and stuff, then by all means ask your questions, but know that what you're doing is inquiring someone's personal experience every time, because they're going to talk to you from not a general standpoint, because as Indigenous peoples, this is what we live through. So if you're going to ask just about something general, like you're actually asking them something very personal and deep down to them and their like fundamental soul, like who they are. So everything that in non-Indigenous peoples need to know should either be asked in person in a polite and respectful way, and protocol as well is really important. I've had many times where people have asked me things and they hand me tobacco as an offering, and you know, that shows a great respect to me, but also other people, other Indigenous peoples around that non-Indigenous person that showed that protocol by offering something as an exchange for the knowledge I'm about to share with them. So all of these things are really valuable teachings that the more you're around Indigenous peoples, you'll know. But for now, that's what I gotta say.
Yeah, that's really good. I feel similarly, like I can answer questions from my point of view, and um, general questions about things that you could find in a book, like statistics and everything. But the only questions that are tricky are questions when they're asked about like the opinions of all Indigenous people, because I can only speak for myself or maybe my community at most, like generally. But you know, Indigenous communities around Canada, around the world, are so different. So like asking questions just about Indigenous people can be really hard to answer. I like when people ask questions personally, but I know for some people it could be really hard and even triggering. Um, but one thing I noticed, I've kind of lived in my Indigenous community pretty much my whole life until the past year. And I've noticed that, like, as I lived here, I've never had to think about these questions or think about people having these questions. And it's a very isolated community. So I've always kind of been around people who understood, and just being so in the culture, I didn't know how to explain it or expect to have to explain it. But after going to my new school, where there's people from all over the world, people who don't understand because they weren't taught or they didn't live in the community, people who don't mean to do something offensive, but it's something that, like, I don't get offended, but like sometimes people say things and it kind of hurts. Like if someone from Europe is talking about the positive benefits of colonialism because that's what they learned, so they, I don't hold it against them, but it just hurts to hear, you know, personally. And I found that I got to taking it a little bit personally and thinking like that kind of person couldn't understand, you know. We had a group of Indigenous students at the school, which really helped me and made me feel like I had a community. But around halfway through the school year, we had an Indigenous Special Topics Day. We had a day where some Indigenous students stood on a panel, and we had a like anonymous questions where we answered, and it was so emotional. And you kind of heard all these questions, some which were worded poorly or they were a little offensive, which maybe stopped people from asking, some which were really basic knowledge. And you realize these are things people don't know. Like, I, being 16, was kind of stupid, and I just assumed people to know because it's such an integral part of my identity. And I realized how basic people's knowledge are. People come to this country without knowing there are Indigenous people here, even without knowing anything about the struggles. And so, you can't begrudge them for not having that knowledge in that case. And I found, like, after that talk, so many people came up to me and they said they really appreciated what I said. They were talking about how much they didn't know beforehand, how much they knew now, how much they wanted to do things to help, to do things to change things. And I found, like, my community wasn't just the little small amount of Indigenous students at that school, it was everybody once they understood. And I feel people are really open to understanding, which is like something I just didn't realize so much before, just because of some experiences with people. Um, and just, yeah, like, if you ask me, I'm just gonna be really, really happy that people care, because I don't know, you kind of grow up with this as an Indigenous person, you grow up with this idea, with this impression that people don't care. Otherwise, how can the world stay this way? Without really realizing how little, some people know. Um, and so just the fact that you care, that will really, you know, bring a lot to knowing. And I feel the more you learn, the more you'll care. So yeah.
Thanks so much. Did you have anything to add on this, Sophia? No? Okay. And because I feel human rights are a shared responsibility of everyone that owns, like, or is entitled to owning a Canadian passport. Like, we, like, so-called Canada, human rights are just like an essential thing that we should all be advocating for, and the respect of them for all citizens. But I was also, when but further than that, because I feel like there's two levels. Like, it's like easy in general for non-Indigenous people to agree that some human rights abuses are terrible and should be repaired, in, like, in to the extent of what is possible. But there's like another layer of that that's often sort of misunderstood. And I was wondering, maybe what is the place of the climate movement in advocating in general, for, like, indigenous self-determination. What do you believe is, what position should we, like, occupy? What general, like, speech should we be holding? I don't know if that's clear.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I guess in terms of speech, I agree that, like, human rights are something that we should all be caring about, and understanding the abuses of human rights in so-called Canada. And and that's not just non-Indigenous peoples, that's also Indigenous peoples, and understanding other human rights abuses in Canada. But also that, in the climate movement, when we talk about how important the climate is, and water and land, and these essential things that all humans need as a human right, and not only as an environmental issue, but as a fundamental human right to need these essential things to live, and to keep going in life, pretty much. You can't live without water, and you can't live without the land, and any land you're on, and clean air. And so all of these things that play a part of each other, and human rights, so other human rights abuses also play a part of that as well, right? So like I was saying before, if you're impoverished and you're living in poverty, you might not have access to the same foods that other people will have. You might not even have access to food at all sometimes, when you're just, you got no more money, and that's it. And that's why living off the land is actually crucial for Indigenous peoples that have been impoverished, and some are continuously impoverished, is because if we can't afford what's in the grocery stores, some of us really depend on what's in that river. And when that river is poisoned, then that's pretty much it for that community. And so the right to say no to extractive resource projects is a life and death situation. And I think other people in Canada don't realize the seriousness and like the severity of that predicament that Indigenous peoples are in when they're asked, do you want this project or not, right? Because you either need the money or you need the land. And either way, there's going to be a trade off in the end, no matter which way you go on it. So, non Indigenous peoples and just the climate movement in general needs to understand that when you're wording things and when you're describing the land, it might not be um, the same feeling, the same sentiment that Indigenous peoples feel, because that, you know, it's like our lifeline. And we had such direct connection, and we still do. Most of us still have that direct connection, trying to find ourselves back on that land. Um, and also, I don't know if this is part of it or not, but land acknowledgements too, and wording things in that regard in the climate movement is also another big part of understanding Indigenous struggle. Um, I find that land acknowledgements are being treated as a script, and I'm not a fan of land acknowledgements now because of that issue that I've had with people that just they're saying it, but like they don't know what they're saying, right? Because when frontline communities like Wet'suwet'en, when they're fighting for their lands, um, that's unceded territory, right? And when I'm here in Ottawa and we do the little script, right, of unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory, that's what Wet'suwet'en is fighting for right now, right? So the fact that we're doing a land acknowledgement saying, oh, we're acknowledging that this was taken illegally from Indigenous peoples, and then you're going to illegally remove people from their territories in other parts of Canada at the same time that you're doing a land acknowledgement, doesn't work for me. And it doesn't work for a lot of Indigenous peoples. So understanding that what you're doing right now with the land acknowledgement is contrary to what other people are doing in other parts of Canada. And that's the government's fault. And I'm not saying that's non Indigenous people's fault in general, but that's just a systematic fault, right? That we're trying to reconcile something that can't be reconciled when it's still going on in the background. And people don't want to look at that. They just want to do the land acknowledgement. So, in terms of wording, it's really important to understand what's happening and if that kind of makes sense with what's happening right now and the conflicts and stuff.
Yeah, that was really well put. I agree. Like, I believe protecting Indigenous rights is protecting environmental rights, because the land and the state of nature is just so vital and so like indistinguishable from our culture, and it is such a, like, one of the founding principles of our culture is the rights of the environment. And so if we had sovereignty over our land to the extent that we should, I believe we would have everything we needed, and it would really help protect the biodiversity and the state of our land. The reason that we have to do things like um, sign off for pipelines, as Sophia was saying, it's because we have no choice now because of the oppression and poverty we've been facing. And if we had that real choice, if we had you know the sovereignty, and if our sovereignty was acknowledged by Canada, then I believe it would really be so beneficial for environmental rights as a side benefit, besides just giving people the human rights that they should have, which everyone should care about.
Yeah, thanks so much for your answers are so generous and interesting. And I think we're all learning so much. And like, but on a practical way, like how do you think like non-Indigenous people can like contribute without, obviously overstepping? and doing the like what's has always been done, like without falling into like colonial patterns. Like how do you think we can like contribute to that fight, and without overstepping, without going beyond what our place is?
I think a simple answer is like be there and be there to like amplify and hold up Indigenous people's voices. Be there to protect us, especially during protests, during land defense, during even spiritual gatherings. Indigenous people have been persecuted and being treated differently by the police than non-Indigenous people, and it's really, really scary. So having particularly white Canadians there showing up in large numbers really protects us and really allows us that space to have our message heard without that same fear. Um, I also believe that if you get to know Indigenous peoples in your community, if you get to know Indigenous activists, environmental activists who are Indigenous, and if you learn from them and if you like work with them, then you'll find what's needed. It's not the same everywhere, but like you can find personal solutions for your community through that dialogue and through having learned. The most important thing is that education and not just the um, typical education of Googling, like that education through real life.
True. um, can you repeat the question? I can't even remember.
Yeah, of course. So the question was, how can non-indigenous movements, or how can the climate movement or non-indigenous individuals like bring their contribution to the fight without overstepping, without doing falling in the same colonial patterns that are very problematic and that we're fighting against.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I was just like so into what Hannah was saying, and then I was like, "Whoa, what was the question?" um, yeah, I think it's just a matter of learning the issues, like we have been talking about, but also um, knowing patterns as well that the government likes to play on as well. So even if you, as a white Canadian settler or a non Indigenous person um, that knows a little bit, not a lot, or maybe a lot, but whatever, um, just understanding what the government might try and do in terms of tactics. So, turning Indigenous communities against each other is a tactic that they've been doing for so long. Trying to turn the narrative of saying that we're anti pipeline protesters is again trying to make sure that Indigenous peoples are clashing against each other, for people, not for Indigenous communities that support the project, right? Like in Wet'suwet'en, they were very much trying to play that us versus them type of scenario. But in reality, um, there's just so many different layers of conflict, and who supports, who doesn't. These are all problems that need to be unveiled, but the media doesn't do that for Indigenous peoples. And I don't think non Indigenous peoples realize how much the media portrays us and the way the government wants us to be portrayed as, and the money involved in that as well. So there's just so many different things to consider, in the climate movement, to making sure that we're not falling back into the colonial patterns of calling ourselves protesters when really we're the rights and title holders of land, or that we're conducting ceremony instead of a protest or a rally. So there's just so many different wording that we could use to avoid those colonial patterns, but also just talking to Indigenous peoples of what they would like to do in the protest, right? Making sure that they're leading is a very good way to avoid overstepping your boundaries as a non Indigenous person. Um, I did the occupation here in Ottawa for the Justice Department, and It was just amazing to see the non-Indigenous peoples just sitting and listening to what we're saying and then responding in so many ways. Like, I was just overwhelmed how many people were asking me, like, what do you need? Like, do you need food, or do you need like blankets, or how long are you? So they were just so caring. And that's kind of the fundamental feeling that I feel when we do actions. And that's a value that Indigenous peoples hold sacred to us. But that's also what we share to non Indigenous peoples in the climate movement, that this is about caring for each other in a way that oversees any colonial agenda, any economic agenda. Like, this is about caring for each other and making sure that we're all taken care of, no matter what community we're from or what's our background or what school you went to. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, as long as we're all taken care of in the climate movement, that's what's important to me and to many other Indigenous peoples leading the fight. Um, and making that room also for ceremony is a really good way to show your respect, and allowing for drumming to take place, singing, because these are how we call our ancestors down. And that's how we gather our strength in the movement. And that's what's kept us alive for so many years. It's that gift that we've been given from Creator to share with everyone else. And that's why we have the medicine wheel too, right? Like, we have like all colors of man. It doesn't matter where you're from, like, we'll share it with you. And I think that's what's really beautiful about the movement, is that we're lapsing climate and we're lapsing Indigenous sovereignty, and we're educating each other and we're learning all from each other. And it's just one big happy, most part happy, when there's not like police and snipers and stuff, family. um, and it's all about taking care of each other, and it's out of love, like Hannah was saying, right? Like, this is not out of hate for the oil and gas industry, and this is out of love for each other and our future. And we're going to carry that hope no matter what, and we'll do whatever it takes, to ensure that for ourselves and for the future.
Okay, and like you were saying about, we were talking about love and, uniting, and I feel like, I've heard you, like, I realized it when I heard you, Sophia, speak in Ottawa the other day about what reconciliation is dead, that's been repeated a lot recently, what it truly means, like, what's behind this affirmation. And I realized how, like, misunderstood this often was. So I was, maybe it's relevant that, you both, give, maybe you give us, your interpretation of this phrase, maybe, if you think it's interesting.
Hannah, do you want to go?
Okay, sure. I think it's a really strong statement, but I do see how, just based on the Canadian government's reactions, like, Canadians and Indigenous people were tired of Canada promising one thing and their actions saying another thing. And that frustration has led to reconciliation is dead. However, like, reconciliation has been worked on, and is like the effort of a lot of people, a lot of Indigenous peoples, like, work towards it. However, the problem with it is it comes from Canada to an extent, and Canada has kind of control over what it means, and the like our relationship. It's not yet treated as it should be, as two sovereign nations, and their discussions and their negotiations. One thing I found, though, like, just being at the legislature and in recent years of activism, is when we were there, there were so many non-Indigenous people there supporting us, so many white Canadians. There are people against us still, but this kind of fight we had to do, it's frustrating because it's the fight my father, my grandfather faced. But at the same time, we have so much more support from the general population, from Canada. That's where the power of the country really is in the people. And seeing the people there for us and seeing all of their support and all of their compassion, all of their passion towards the cause really made me see the change that happened since that time. It's happened, for us. It's happened within the people you see down there every day. And I feel that we'll always be in this fight to an extent. Like, my grandchildren will probably be in this fight and have to fight for their land. But that doesn't mean that we give up just because the fight's not going to end. We have to make sure they have land to fight for. And if they have, a community of non-Indigenous people, if they have, the country on their side, um, in the people, I really believe that there can be a reconciliation within citizens.
Yeah, I heard that a lot too from other people saying that, reconciliation is a relationship. And that, if other people take it upon themselves to reconcile with Indigenous peoples as the people, as other non-Indigenous peoples, then by all means, carry that out and take that responsibility to make sure that, like we were saying before, not to fall into colonial patterns or a colonial relationship, even within yourself, and understanding if perhaps maybe you've adopted some of the preconceived notions that the government wanted you to conceive, and also that, you know reconciliation is such a really big idea that, encapsulates a lot, right? Because reconciling is trying to mend, uh, a relationship, right? And to reconcile something that has been, not good, I guess. Um, but the thing is that if, like Hannah said, if we're two sovereign nations, then you can kind of picture ourselves as two people in a relationship, right? So just one person and another person, and they're in a relationship. And when there are problems in that relationship, and reconciliation was an attempt to try and make sure that these people, mend their problems and get back together or something, then, um, that's something that it takes both people to do. And what we've seen so far is that one person, which would be Indigenous peoples, said, you know what, this is not working for me. Like, I'm leaving. I'm sovereign, so I don't need to be in this relationship. So reconciliation is dead is a statement saying that, like, I'm no longer trying to fix this relationship that has never been good. This relationship has never been, um, a fixable thing, really. And reconciliation is also something that the government was using to try and make sure that another Oka crisis wasn't going to happen. And how many times did we hear Oka crisis and Ipperwash during the Wet'suwet'en, like that fear of, like, oh my God, are they going to retaliate? Well, this wouldn't happen if reconciliation was an actual priority for your government. Reconciliation is something that both partners need to be working on. And all I see is, when reconciliation is dead, then the government turns around and says, no, 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 it's not dead until I say it's dead. Well, no, they're sovereign. So if they want to say it's dead, they can say it's dead, and then it's dead, Like, you find another relationship that works for both of you. But, what we're seeing is like this power dynamic thing, and Canada doesn't want to let go of their power and the control that they have on Indigenous peoples. And this is not going to go away until the underlying root of the problem is addressed, which is, this is colonialism and this is genocide still happening. And we want to cut those ties that are controlling our nations all the time. But we can't do that if, the government doesn't want to let go of their reins, right? And why do they want those reins in the first place, right? It's because they want to continue the genocide. They want to continue the suffering onto indigenous peoples, because they want our lands. It really doesn't have anything much else to do with us as a people, or it's really just we hold resources that they want, whether it's lumber and forestry, or oil and gas, or something else like water, that will become scarce in the future as the climate crisis worsens. This relationship is just going to get like tighter and tighter and tighter until the government is just going to have a full-fledged um, dictatorship on indigenous peoples. And we already see that anyway, where indigenous peoples are restricted fundamental rights and just like a fundamental relationship basis on the right to say no. I mean, if your partner talked to you and said, "So, do you want to go to Tim Hortons or McDonald's?" And then you were like, "I want to go to Tim Hortons." And then your partner was like, "We're going to McDonald's, whether you like it or not. And like, I'll kill you if you go to Tim Hortons." I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but that's exactly the boat that indigenous peoples are in, right? Like they don't want something and it's being forced upon them as if like there's no other option, as if it doesn't make economic sense. But the reality is that genocide actually takes quite a lot of money, right? To have the whole RCMP detachments target indigenous women, and to make sure that pipeline workers are perpetuating sexual violence onto indigenous women and making them go missing. I mean, that takes quite a lot of money to ensure that, and to ensure that the population is not going to recover from this, and to ensure that the children of these people and these women that have these experiences are going to grow up with the feeling of being ashamed instead of the feeling of being empowered by their identity and the fact that they have the power and the people do have the power. And that's why indigenous youth are so critical in the climate movement. It's because we finally are recognizing, after so much oppression, that we do have the power, and other non-indigenous peoples have that power to empower us. And it's just such an interesting way to formulate a whole revolution. And that's really what it is a revolution of indigenous, non-indigenous peoples alike that are coming together for one cause, but incorporating indigenous sovereignty, like Hannah was saying. I mean, that's the forefront of it, and it has to be centered and it has to be prioritized in everything that we do, because freedom for some is not freedom for all. And if you're still oppressing indigenous peoples in the climate movement, that's not a fight for freedom. That's just wanting privilege for more people, right? So ensuring that every fundamental right to land and water foremost is going to indigenous peoples whose land that we're on. That's important for the climate movement. And that's something that needs to be prioritized when we think of reconciliation is dead, that we're talking about indigenous peoples, and to understand that that is a very colonial mentality, to think that indigenous peoples can't say no to projects. And reconciliation itself was a colonial idea to try and get indigenous peoples to become their friends so that they would sign on the dotted line, and that corporations wouldn't have to try so hard to kill them if they just signed for the project. um, and there's just a lot of different things, and I could go on for a very long time. But I won't, so I'm just gonna stop there.
I think we'd all like if you did. But yeah, like you both said, I think that it's important. Like I might be summarizing or like, but you both said that it was important to give visibility to indigenous voices within movements that are not necessarily intrinsically indigenous. Like such as the climate movement. I mean, we can talk about the specific climate movement. So, what's the do you often like see tokenization in the way this visibility is given to indigenous individuals by the climate movement? And do you feel like sometimes this fight for self-determination is used by the climate movement as an argument in a way that should not be, or that is disrespectful and dismissive?
Okay, I'll go. I guess yeah. Short answer is uh, like to make sure that it's not tokenistic, and that you actually value indigenous knowledge is a personal thing that someone needs to work on. I mean, if you want to make sure that you're not tokenistic, just make sure that you're not inviting somebody for the sake of having an indigenous person check, um, and making sure that it makes sense with maybe the other stuff that you're saying, and incorporating it into whatever you're doing. Uh, I know a lot of people were using land acknowledgements and getting one indigenous person, but then the rest of the conference or the rest of whatever it was just non-indigenous, like everything, non-indigenous discussions. And um, that's something that can't happen in the climate movement, especially when we're trying to fight for self-determination and sovereignty. um, and it takes a lot of different special people that recognize how important it is to have indigenous knowledge and how different it is from other knowledge and other point of views that people have, right? So um, that's a personal struggle, I guess, that people will need to figure out within themselves if they're tokenistic or not. Uh, but if you're a part of something, even just criticizing something you're a part of, like a rally or like a general climate strike thing, making sure that it's not tokenistic, like anyone can do that just from a bird's eye point of view. And by calling someone out on it or suggesting how to make it less tokenistic and more indigenous centered could actually make that climate strike a lot easier for indigenous peoples to be a part of.
Yeah. Personally, I haven't noticed any I haven't like personally been affected by any instances of tokenism. However, I do know that it is a big problem and it is like easy to fall into that, especially because I feel if you don't come to this problem with like very specific questions and with a very specific like frame of mind where you're respectful and you're coming at it for the right reasons, it's easy to just say a few lines and get someone to um give that opening speech. And I have come across people who like attempt to do that kind of thing, but just because you don't understand better. Um, However, I do believe that like indigenous peoples should really like if you're just in a room and there's only like one person different from you, or you look around and there's no one different from you, there's a problem with that room. And I feel the climate action is something a lot of people can come from a very privileged point of view. Things like veganism or like living zero waste. Like not everybody can afford to do that, especially like people in poverty, which is a lot of time people in indigenous, like indigenous kind of ways of life. So if you kind of approach this idea of like, say, using veganism as an example, everyone should be vegan. Like you look at like how indigenous people have this like different relationship with the food they hunt and like a different kind of culture towards eating meat, and you kind of realize how um, kind of elitist some of these things could be. Another example is like seal hunting. Seal hunting is a really big moneymaker for environmental groups. However, like seals and seal hunting is really, really important for Indigenous peoples in the North, and not only as a food source, but also as an industry. And just the fact that like they can't be sold and they're viewed in such a negative light um, really has taken a toll on people, you know? And so you have to like um, see how you're like approaching environmental issues and see how they might come from a place of privilege and just ensure that you're not like accidentally just because of lack of knowledge doing something that like shows privilege or just shows like something that could harm indigenous people like inadvertently.
Thank you. I'll also just letting know everyone, we'll start taking questions from you guys, the audience, in about 10 minutes. So if you like, you can start thinking about them, writing them down, and sending them in the comment section of the live. So I was thinking of maybe, I don't know if last question, but there's a big clash between the way the media depicts like represents the climate movement and like the cute Fridays for Future high school strikers with like flowers and smiles, and the way people, you know indigenous people that are fighting for similar things are depicted as being dangerous, and in a very in a way that is not actually true, and in a way that is makes it seem very aggressive, and that's often very just blatantly racist. And so do you feel like the climate movement maybe has a way to act on this, like to use this image and like creates the right bonds so that a different image is created to like I feel like there's a lot of humanity and compassion that comes when you see kids demonstrating for their future, and people don't get that it's about it's not the same thing, but it's about um the same issues that are connected. And so like do you think of like some paths that could potentially go in the direction of like solving this or like doing something about it?
um yeah, I find that it's absolutely ridiculous to me how differently the environmental movement and indigenous rights movements are portrayed by the media, and how we're portrayed so like you know, aggressively when it's really not like that. That's just another example of, racism in Canadian society. And I feel it's something that I know how to like only address on a like personal level. And hopefully eventually that um, changes things. But coming from, an Indigenous community and living here my whole life, these aren't issues I've had to deal with until like personally until very recently. And so personally, I'm still like reeling and trying to figure out how to deal with this kind of thing and how to, change the narrative, especially when we're trying, but and we keep on, telling people these things like the leaders of the legislature movement made every day, every few hours, extremely clear that we're here for love. They would say that they would, you know, take out any like one who looked like they might be violent. It was made very respectful, very like a very spiritual experience. And yet the way the media demonstrated everything was so incredibly different. And I I haven't figured it out yet how to change that, but when I do, I'll let you know. Maybe Sophia has an answer.
Yeah, and I just think it's a really big issue, right? And I don't think there's one good solution to solving media and colonialism together, but definitely understanding the issue is the first step to solving the issue, right? Because if you don't understand the issues fully, then you won't be able to solve the issues fully. And that's just like kind of my motto in life. Um, and when we were at the Department of Justice for our occupation, it was the same thing, right? Like we had press conferences every day, And we had, reporters coming in and out, and we had a lot of issues with boundaries. And that's pretty much what Suwon was all about, which I found kind of funny, right? Because, like, we're trying to say you're overstepping like your privilege in Canada, and why are you on Wet'suwet'en territory? And then you have reporters that are overstepping their um, duties and just like really aggressive, trying to get in the doors, and intimidation tactics, and telling people they need to say their last names and why are you here, just like really aggressive questions. And I've done other interviews for other things, and of course not everyone's going to be nice, but when it was in light of this conflict, they were trying to portray us in a certain way. And no matter what question I got asked, I tried to make sure that it was clear to everybody that we were here for one reason, and that, our demands weren't ridiculous. Like they were trying to make it out like, oh, the government could never um, respect Indigenous peoples. That's ridiculous. like, like these are fundamental rights, and I would try to explain it to reporters even off camera, right? Like you can't be barging into our meetings, and when we have our own meetings, like you shouldn't be videotaping us, and just protocol that you go to school for this. And there's just a lot of different ways that the media portrays us, like I said before, anti-pipeline protesters, and we're dangerous, we're violent, we're uneducated. And then they'll get like a clip of like somebody who wasn't even part of the actions or something, like just somebody off the street, and they'll like just change the narrative completely. um but it's really important to reiterate that. And just like at the ledge, we also reiterated that hourly too. We would say we're peaceful, we're unarmed, and we're for Wet'suwet'en. And it was kind of made into a joke because we would say it so often. Um, but we had to, because of the security people in the building that were changing. And if they were new, then they would get like really aggressive with us sometimes, and not letting us go outside, and just various things that they would try and do to us, to try and make us leave, or to try and make us uncomfortable and feel unsafe. And um, again, these are all tactics that I personally knew already going into this occupation. But for non-Indigenous peoples, it was the first time, like, oh, I feel uncomfortable and unsafe, and I don't like this feeling. And I'm like, this is Indigenous people walking down the street every day. Um, so, trying to shape that narrative that we're just peaceful, and we are unarmed, and we have drums and songs and prayers, and this is a very peaceful movement. And, just like the civil rights movement in the States, that was a peaceful movement until the government goes and enacts violence on the people. And that's what I've been seeing here too. It's exactly the same thing. It's when they enact the violence against us, um, then they wonder why, people are upset. Well, if you didn't, if you didn't like put people to gunpoint all the time and incarcerate them and beat them up in prison, then maybe we would have a better relationship, and we wouldn't need to be out in the streets every second day. But that's just not the case. And that's the same thing with the climate movement that needs to happen, is to make sure that when Indigenous peoples are part of the climate strikes, and um, you know, uh, when Indigenous peoples are sharing their stories, to allow the media to cover that within the climate movement, so that they understand that these are both in the same fight, and that even from somebody just scrolling through Facebook, that they can understand that, oh, like I see representation here. And that's really important, to just see people that don't look the same, like Hannah was saying, right? Like if everyone looks the same, there's an issue. And that's the same thing in the climate movement. Like you can't just be having non-Indigenous and white people talk about Indigenous peoples and then say, yeah, that was good enough. It, we need to make sure that we're um, having people that are Indigenous speak on their own behalves, and to understand that these are really important issues that need to be covered properly.
Thanks so much to you both for this first part of the presentation. So for the next 30 minutes, we're gonna be like, I'm just gonna be passing on questions from the public. I'm like trying to surf in the comments. I might have skipped some, like I might skip some without, out of goodwill. I'm sorry if I do. So coming from Eli Prudon, what would be, I think, it's a question that I used to ask myself also, and that's can seem like it's very important sort of to be find an answer to. um like, what would be a respectful way to get in touch with local indigenous people and building solidarity links? Like, like on a practical way, it's often seems like it doesn't necessarily seem obvious to someone that doesn't necessarily know much, and I've been in this situation. So like, what is there, like a first step that would make it like better for both like the individual taking this action and like the indigenous person on the other side that's gonna have to, yeah, answer this?
Um, well, obviously, I've never had that issue as an Indigenous person. Maybe you could speak to the other side of it. But what I notice is a lot of people come here with like kind of the idea of like getting something for themselves out of an Indigenous community. Like for example, I don't know, like students or something, like you can come here and learn with goodwill and have people like willing to teach you, or you could come here and go about it in the wrong manner where you're kind of like demanding from elders to like get lessons or whatever. It's really important it comes from the ground up. So I'd recommend, finding people in your community who have similar like interests, similar like goals to you. If there's any like local indigenous like group of young people doing similar work, and start with them, and they will help you lead things up if they're interested in working with you, and just you know offer your help however it could be. Volunteer. I think it's really different depending on the community, but if you just get to know people, make indigenous friends on a personal level, and understand their issues, you could see what you can do instead of coming into it with the idea of what you can do already. It really, you have to find out what your community needs before you can offer things.
Yeah, true. Um, I guess also social media is a good way as well. There's a lot of Indigenous activists that are active on social media. You have, Get 'em Done Checkpoint and Indian Collective, and there's a lot of resources for non-Indigenous peoples to get involved, to get educated, but also to reach out, right? Like slide in their DMs, and if you need to request some people, that's the great thing about Indian country. That's like what Indigenous peoples call it, is Indian country. But like we almost everyone knows everyone, like at some point, when you're in the same circles, the same fight, like you get to know people. So if you asked me if I knew anyone out east, I could refer you to some people that I know out east. I could refer you to some people I know in the prairies. I could refer you to some people I know out west. And I have done so throughout this uh, past few months. And I know that other people elsewhere have done that for me as well. So, just that connectivity, even if you know one Indigenous group or one Indigenous person, turns out they'll probably know other Indigenous groups and other Indigenous people. And it's just trying to find the right person within all the different circles that they're a part of. But it's pretty easy to find activists, Indigenous activists in this age. But definitely the pages too. If you don't know any on a personal level, like just message the pages, and they could probably help you in whatever city you're a part of.
Thanks. So next question coming from Gabriel Veilleux. So, and I think that I feel like it's very relevant since, there's indigenous communities, especially the Wet'suwet'en, that are still on the front lines in the midst of the COVID crisis. And so, how can we best organize and mobilize around indigenous and climate issues online during the social isolation? So like, is there a way to still be relevant when there's these people battling for, some very basic elements of life on the front lines?
Yeah, I feel like there is a lot you can do through either donating. This is a good thing. Being here, good first step. Um, organizing online strike activities. There's obviously staying educated with the latest news. You could sign up for a mailing list with the Wet'suwet'en people, and then kind of, they send like what they need, what's going on, and like the latest updates, which is really helpful. It's really hard to not be out there, especially while CGL is out there. You feel so much you have to be out there, but obviously safety is number one. So I'd keep with donating. And another thing is now you have like a lot more time on your hands, just like really, really try and convince other people in your families. Like, learn about who's financing CGL, the banks involved. Do you know anyone like using those banks? Try and like be annoying until they stop using those banks. Um, that kind of thing. And just going to people in your social circle, people who don't maybe politically agree with you, and just try and like educate others, I feel is a really good step, because like the more people educated and interested, the harder it is for the country to continue with the oppression.
Mhm. Yeah, 100%. Agree with that. And also, like Hannah said, relaying information is important. So keeping up with what are the latest updates is a really good way to make sure that you're doing your part, which is being educated and being informed, right? That's the most that Wet'suwet'en can ask for at the moment during a global pandemic. But for sure, there's so many other things that you can be doing. So by understanding what's going on the ground right now, you can be calling, like Hannah said, to relay that information, making sure that the people held accountable know that you aren't stopping, right? Like that's all you really need right now, is to gain that momentum again and the traction, and to make them understand that this is your top priority, and you're not going anywhere, even in the midst of a pandemic, and you still know what's going on, even if the media isn't covering it one bit. An example of that would be the Keystone XL pipeline that they're going to be building today, right? Like, I'm furious about it. And the only thing I can really do is call people and to let them know that this is happening, and that I know, and that I'm not okay with it, and that I'm insulted. Like, that's all I can do right now. Another thing, too, that I've discussed with people here in Ottawa, but it would be great to gain some momentum elsewhere. And I know a lot of people are probably based out of Montreal and Quebec on this call, um, and probably elsewhere too. But grocery stores. So you have a lot of people in grocery stores, and you're supposed to be keeping your distance, which is great. But if you have stickers for Wet'suwet'en, if you have like stickers that say "All Eyes on Wet'suwet'en" or "Reconciliation is Dead," or if you have posters or whatever, like just kind of keep it in your pocket, grab your groceries, and then when you leave, just slap it on the door as you walk out. I've done that so many times. They'll probably take it down that day, but I don't care. So it's a very silent way to act in this time. But if you have 500 people in the grocery stores coming in and out all the time, like, there you go, right? It's just a little reminder to get people thinking about it again in the midst of COVID and with all the COVID news at the grocery store. Um, and I know that a lot of front lines are still making sure that they're keeping up their blockades. So Six Nations still has their blockade. Akwesasne put up a blockade recently, and these aren't talked about. And they're struggling too with supplies and resources and what they might need, right? So um, I would say keeping up with new solidarity news elsewhere in case they need something is a really good way to just keep the momentum going with the movement that we're facing. And I think rolling blockades are going to be a very useful thing in the future if COVID keeps going on and if they go ahead with CGL and start relaying the pipes on their territory. Then you're going to see a lot of people very angry, especially when it's not going to be talked about. So um, I think just get prepared is all I can say. Like, this is not going anywhere, and the situation is getting worse. So to make sure that you're up to date and calling and putting stickers in grocery stores, that's the most we can do now.
Thanks. Um, Also, next question I received. So, what do you see as some steps we can take to implementing environmental and indigenous policy worldwide, linking them, and how can those who are non-indigenous act in solidarity with indigenous people, and what perspective should we keep in mind to make sure we are giving indigenous people the love and respect they deserve? So that's all in terms of like policy. So like, as a movement, we have demands. We spoke about it the other day, but like, we're as Lesev, we ask for like UNDRIP to be implemented until further consultation of the indigenous people, because they we think that they must have the last word. But like, what do you think are like effective policy paths that we should explore and that we should yeah, advocate for?
Well, again, it's like different really depending if you're like doing community wide, nationwide in a province, and you'll want to like have a lot of consultation and make sure there's a lot of communication with indigenous peoples and not just a certain amount, like as many indigenous peoples as you could get, as many perspectives as you can get. And I really believe that UNDRIP is an amazing place to start because it's over 20 years in the making. Every country's assigned it. It's got a lot of power and is very comprehensive when it comes to indigenous people's rights, but we're still so far away from it in Canada. And I believe like because of the extent of indigenous consultation, because of it's like out of you know it's kind of from the indigenous perspective, out of indigenous people's voices. I believe that that's a really strong step, but it's also really going to be hard to achieve. So we need to kind of look more closely at UNDRIP and more closely how we can work to achieve like each individual like article of the declaration, because it's not going to be easy, and it's not as simple as saying we want you to support UNDRIP. It's like getting into the specifics, saying how they could support UNDRIP right now, what they're doing against UNDRIP. And I just really believe that's something that we need to work on more, but it's a really, really good starting place.
Yeah, UNDRIP is the place to start with, I think, for a lot of reasons. But I guess the one that's often quoted is Article 10 for the consultation and consent, free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples, and um, that's the prominent one. But again, there's so many other articles that all relate to that in a way. Like every article is talking about either culture, about language, about freedom, about land, and these are all things that are essential for Indigenous peoples to survive and to thrive. And so that would be a very important bill to support, no matter where you are in Canada and no matter where you are ever. UNDRIP is a universal declaration that can be applied to any country because every country has indigenous peoples, even European countries. And I think keeping up with the news, I know it sounds redundant, but it's true, because a lot of news is getting lost in the midst of COVID. And there are still a lot of issues, even issues that were already there before are even worse now in in COVID, because it's being lost in the news. So there was a protester bill that was passed in the United States, to criminalize protesters over fossil fuels in Nebraska, in West Virginia, and another state. But again, that law was passed in the midst of COVID because now they can get away with it because nobody's talking about it. And that targets the Keystone XL pipeline that they want to put in because that's exactly the states that are going to be affected. And of course, there are indigenous peoples in those states. And of course, there was opposition prior to this. So putting in this bill silently is not an effective response to COVID, right? Like you can't just take this pandemic as a free for all to do whatever you want with your country and to make it authoritarian. We're still a democratic country, supposedly, which means we need to be keeping our government accountable for all these things that they're trying to get away with in COVID. Alberta as well, you know, having war rooms. Like what? Like, how are we a democratic country and Alberta has war rooms to have their war strategies planned out to a T? I mean, you know, so there's so many different things that you need to keep up with, and it's really hard to keep up with everything. But um, just to know that they're there. So, you know, that protester bill in the United States, the war room in Alberta, and the Indian Act that is still in place and still striving to kill Indians. I mean, you know, we all need to be aware of these things. And UNDRIP eliminates a lot of those barriers. So, to understanding what's in place and to understanding what we're looking to move towards, which is UNDRIP and a better future, essentially.
At the same time, I just want to reiterate, like right now is a really difficult time for a lot of people, and so it might be really, really hard to keep up with everything, and especially like activism at this time. And just so you know, like it's okay to take a break, especially in the midst of like a global pandemic. We do need people that aren't taking a break, but you know, you need to rest and you need to be at your best when everything's over, and you need to like stay safe and healthy. So if all you could do is like repost something on social media every now and again, something little, like that's okay too, you know? Because
Mm-hmm.
yeah, mental health is really, really important, and a lot of activists forget about that and just run themselves way too far.
Yeah, you're right. Um, so and like this might be a last question we take, and I feel like it's gonna be interesting. So coming from Mili, so how do you feel about non-Indigenous people using the land back reclamation statement in the climate strike events about the abolition of pipeline projects as such as the CGL pipeline?
Yeah, so um, there's now like a new post for from Climate Strikes Canada that I was part of writing, in light of uh, the climate strikes in the United States that wanted to use land back for merchandise. Um, I think it's a very tricky question, in the sense that, you know, how can you own words? Like nobody really owns words, but at the same time, like there are things that people know not to say because it's offensive, and people know racial slurs, and people know the barriers of things. But for land back, it depicts the struggle of Indigenous peoples, and their theft of land, right? Like their land was stolen from them, and it is continuously being stolen as we speak. So um, if you are using land back and you can use the phrase land back. I'm not saying like you can't ever say it. Like I encourage people to say land back in in protests and in rallies and in marches and in ceremonies, but just to know what that entails and the privilege that we have to be able to use this when we were silenced for so many years, right? And that the fact that this is indigenous centered and that like white people can't really like post land back in the same way indigenous people can, right? Because like it's a very different thing. It's indigenous peoples that are having their land stolen. That's why they want land back, not other people wanting land back that it's not their land. Like it's really a weird phrase for some people, but just to keep in mind that it is indigenous centered, and if you are going to use land back for anything that you do, just make sure that you know what you're doing and to make sure everyone around you knows what you're doing. So in light of CGL pipeline, that's why we were using land back, and non-indigenous peoples were screaming land back in our rallies, but that was okay because of the context of Wet'suwet'en and CGL. But you can't just say land back for anything.
I think that was a really good answer.
Okay.
So also people were wondering if you could please make a list of maybe like your favorite resources on everything that we talked about. Like Sophia, I think, mentioned a website earlier, or like one of you two mentioned a website that you found was interesting. So yes, so maybe if you could take like some, I don't want to ask any more of your time, but like that would be very cool, and so that we can share that as well with what we've all learned today. So yes, I don't want to take any more of your time. So I really want to thank everyone for taking part in this. Thank you for your excellent questions. And thanks you for being such amazing speakers. It's all so clear and concise, and you're so wow. So just like huge thank you to everyone. So the live will end now. It will keep being on Facebook, so it's not gonna disappear. The video is still available. So I feel like it really deserves to like be shared. What was said here is precious, and as we said it, like it can be exhaustive to just like repeat over and over. So if it would be cool if this was shared, I believe. So if you have a couple of friends who are also who could also very much benefit from this, that would be cool. We have activities planned for the rest of the week. Also, tomorrow's a webinar about ecofeminism, so you're all invited. This one's going to be in French, and we have like online day of mobilization on Friday. That's also going to end with a webinar with also I don't know more activist Melissa Malin Dupree will be there. So that's going to be interesting. So I'm like, would you have something to that you would like to add? Like Hannah and Sophia, like, is there something you would like to conclude with? Um, or we can just end on this also.
Yeah, I'd just like to thank everyone really quickly. Thank you for listening. And yeah, my heart goes out to you in this difficult time, and I really um hope you and your people are keeping safe and healthy. And thank you, Albert, for being such a great moderator, and Sophia for your awesome words, and Isabel for organizing stuff, and see you guys at the other webinars.
Yeah, I just wanted to say the same thing too. Thanks for listening and putting your questions out. And if we didn't answer all of them, hopefully we can answer them at a different time. And Hannah for speaking from the heart as usual, and Albert for, organizing as you always do amazing work. And yeah, just everyone being amazing. It's just really empowering.
Well, thanks so much. So I think we can wish everyone a good evening and see you tomorrow for the next activities that are planned and that promise to be very interesting. So see you. Stay tuned.